So hello dear students, welcome to Bajirao Ias Academy interview guidance program. So in this lecture we are going to discuss about United Nations Security Council reform process. So United Nations Security Councils are one of the important topic for your mains examination as well as for your interview. So there is a probability that the panel members may ask you questions about United Nations Security Council reforms. Why? Because India has been constantly advocating for the expansion of United Nations Security Council reforms. Since India has met all the eligibility criteria to be included or to be part of the United Nations Security Council, and it is also essential and important to reform the multilateral institutions including UN and United Nations Security Council. So in this particular lecture we will understand what is the importance of expansion of United Nations Security Council, or how it brings or how it revives or how it make United Nations more and more relevant for the present context, and also try and understand what are the major challenges in the expansion of the United Nations Security Council, and what are the measures or what are the initiatives taken by different countries to be part of the or to expand United Nations Security Council, right? So firstly, if you look at United Nations Security Council briefly, okay, so now we are living in 21st century. So if you look at United Nations, so United Nations clearly represent the Second World War, post Second World War realities, as it was established in the year 1945, right? So in 21st century the main question is UN relevant today? Okay, so the main question is UN relevant today? Because it is not representing the 21st century realities, rather it has been representing the 20th century, the mid 20th century realities, the mid 20th century world order. So therefore the UN structure, so the overall structure of the UN and the decision making process within United Nations and the effectiveness of United Nations actually come under scrutiny. Okay, so since it has not representing the current realities, so the structure, decision making process and effectiveness of UN has come under the scrutiny. It is being criticized or it is being evaluated by other important regional countries, okay, so which have been aspiring a place in the global high table. So therefore in this context, reforms within the structure of the UN are actually imperative. Okay, so reforms within United Nations and United Nations Security Council are imperative or important to bolster or to further strengthen its overall efficacy. Now please understand, if United Nations has not been representing the current realities, how can we say that it is more efficient, it is more representative body? Okay, so we cannot say that it is a representative or democratic body. It has been serving the interests of all the countries equally. Rather, it is serving the interests of very few countries which are part of the United Nations Security Council. So the reform process has been stalled over decades. So therefore, the overall reform process of UN structure is very important to enhance transparency and boost the overall credibility of the United Nations. Okay, so in order to boost the credibility, legitimacy and bring more transparency in the United Nations, it is very important that we need to reform the UN structure. Now in this context we need to understand the historical backgrounds of establishing United Nations. So when it was established, so as I have told you that UN represents the post-Cold War realities. So therefore United Nations was formed in the year 1945. Okay, so it was established aftermath of World War II. Now the UN Charter essentially comprises of the principles upon which the UN has established right? So this UN Charter was signed on June 26, 1945. So you just remember that the UN Charter was actually signed by 52 countries on June 26, 1945. So after signing of this UN Charter, United Nations established officially. Okay, so UN was established officially after signing of this UN Charter. So with its entry into force after the UN Charter, which came into force the October 24, 1945, as being celebrated as UN Day. Okay, so United Nations Day is celebrated on October 24, 1945. So this is the background of formation of the United Nations. Now in this context, we need to understand certain founding principles of United Nations which are part of the Charter or UN Charter. And the first founding principle of UN is collective security. Okay, so I hope you know about collective security. Now when we talk about collective security, so it is not the security of countries in one particular region, or it is not about the security of countries which form a particular group, a particular alliance, or it is not related to the security of one country. Rather, it relates to the security of all the countries. So this is the essential principle behind collective security. Now UN established collective security to address threats to the international peace. Now if you look at the international structure, so there are number of factors which has been affecting global peace. For example, terrorism is a threat to global peace. So therefore UN has particularly established to ensure collective security that addresses the threats of international peace. Now how we can ensure international peace? So UN will facilitate diplomacy, economics, military action as per the guidelines which are in the charter. Okay, so diplomacy, trade, economics and military will be used to protect international peace. Okay, now the UN peacekeeping force or UN peacekeeping mission has also derived from the collective security. Now after that, we need to talk about the United Nations Security Council as an organization which is a very important body of the United Nations. So this United Nations Security Council actually consists of P5 members. So these P5 members are permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So they are permanent members. Now what are the member countries which are part of the P5? So they include China, Russia, USA, UK and France. So these are the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So all those countries have the veto power. For example, in order to take a decision, there should be a consensus among all the P5 countries or P5 member countries. Since every country holds a veto power, so any decision by the P5 or Security Council can be vetoed by one single country. And this is where the global the conflict has actually started. Okay, so this is where the world has divided into two groups. So all these P5 countries hold veto powers. So they established as central organ to enforce the principles of collective security. So there are certain principles which ensure collective security, right? So any decision which is taken as part of the collective security will be enforced by the United Nations Security Council and consensus within all the member countries. Okay, so therefore the P5 will ensure major powers play active involvement, or they play active role in ensuring global security. Now after that, we need to talk about the disarmament. Okay, so nuclear disarmament. disarmament with respect to arms and ammunition. So because they can also threaten global security and global peace. Now, the nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorists is a major topic that is being discussed. So what if the nuclear weapons go into the hands of the terrorists? For example, a soft state like Pakistan, there may be a threat that because Pakistan is a nuclear weapon state, there may be a chance that those nuclear weapons will be taken over by the terrorist organizations, and that ultimately threaten the global peace and security. So therefore, here in this context, UN mandates that every country work in coordination and cooperation to ensure disarmament. Okay, so UN Charter prioritizes disarmament and arms control, so that could mitigate the global conflict risks. So for example, if we have any conflicts at the global level, so that could be mitigated by the efforts of all the countries which are part of the UN. Okay, so there are certain agreements, certain mechanisms which ensure disarmament. For example, we can talk about the Wassenaar arrangement, missile technology control regime, right? So all those things will ensure disarmament. And comprehensive test ban treaty, non-proliferation treaty. So all those agreements or treaties are aimed at disarmament. Next, we need to talk about the peacekeeping, right? So we all know that United Nations has a peacekeeping force, and India is one of the largest contributor of personnel to the UN peacekeeping force. And this is one such reason based on which India has been demanding a seat in the United Nations Security Council. So if we talk about United Nations peacekeeping, UN has a strong peacekeeping missions. So in Africa, particularly the Central African countries, so where UN has conducted different peacekeeping operations or peacekeeping missions. So these peacekeeping missions primarily aimed to promote peace and security by deploying the forces into the conflict zones and upholding ceasefires, safeguarding civilians, aiding the peace talks between different groups. Now, if you look at the African countries, the major problem within African countries is political instability, military coup, and even a frequent civil war-like conditions. So therefore, UN peacekeeping forces will ensure peace and security, protecting the lives of the people who are living in those conflict areas. So this is also part of the founding principles of UN. Now after that, we need to talk about the importance of the UN. So what is the importance of UN and what is the relevance of UN in the present context? So experts have been debating that the relevance or importance of UN at the present context has been declining. So why it has been declining? Because the UNSC has been largely divided into two groups. So on one group, China, Russia, and on the other group, the Western countries. And since it has been divided into blocks, so there's no chance that the effective decision making can be possible within the United Nations Security Council. This is the first reason. Okay, and the second reason, there are UN has not representing the current realities, and several countries like Asia and Africa, South America, they do not have representation in the United Nations. So all these factors have been pointing to the fact that UN is no more relevant in the present context. So therefore, we will understand the importance of UN briefly. So first, UN has a key role with respect to addressing global challenges. How? So firstly, peacekeeping and conflict resolution. See, if you look at the United Nations peacekeeping force, so it is one of the successful peacekeeping force, right? So it has been deployed in several countries in Africa and even in Middle East. Okay, so peacekeeping force has the credibility of maintaining peace and security in those regions where it has been deployed. And UN has also been playing a very important and a very critical role with respect to conflict resolution. So okay, overall we can say that the peacekeeping force has a pivotal role in maintaining global UN. Largely UN has a pivotal role in maintaining global peace through the peacekeeping missions. So therefore, but the criticism here is that UN has largely failed with respect to the Russia-Ukraine war, preventing the Russia-Ukraine war. And secondly, recent Hamas-Israel conflict also. So, the role of UN is very very minimal. Okay, so it has a very minimal role. So therefore, in this context, it is being criticized. Now, after that, we need to talk about the humanitarian assistance and developmental progress as well. Okay, so what does it mean when we say about humanitarian assistance and developmental programs? So there are different organizations. There are different organizations within UN, right? Like World Food Program. Okay, so these organizations will ensure that they ensure. So these organizations at the international level, or these UN-based organizations, will ensure vital humanitarian aid. Will UN So UN offers vital humanitarian aid to communities, so they are being affected by different crises. Okay, so for example, the refugee crisis in Middle East. Okay, so the refugee crisis in Middle East, or recent Turkey earthquake. So in all those aspects, UN plays a very key role, a very important role, particularly during natural disasters, armed conflicts. So we can imagine the role of UN with respect to Afghanistan humanitarian crisis, with respect to Afghanistan crisis and Yemen civil war. So therefore, UN has a key role with respect to humanitarian assistance and developmental programs. Now, after that, we need to talk about the environment and climate change initiatives also. So when we talk about the environmental and climate change initiatives, for example, we need to talk about United Nations Environment Program. So that is one of the very important organizations which ensures the environmental protection, environmental sustainability, which has a key data, and which also collaborates with different countries. Okay, so therefore, the environmental and climate change initiatives of UN, for example, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that is also one of the most important framework with respect to mitigation of climate change. Okay, so therefore the UN addresses climate challenges by promoting global cooperation. So it has been promoting global cooperation. So the Paris Agreement, COP21, so it is one of the notable example of UN-led effort to combat climate change. So not just this, so there are multiple conventions, treaties, agreements, so which are actually supported by the United Nations. Now, after that, we need to talk about the reform of the United Nations Security Council. Now, previously we talked about environmental and climate change initiatives, and here we should talk about the SDGs, Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development. Earlier, we have launched, the UN has launched the Millennium Developmental Goals. So they were largely achieved. So countries have largely progressed towards achieving all the Millennium Developmental Goals. And when we talk about the Sustainable Developmental Goals, so now every country has been moving at a rapid pace in towards achieving all the Sustainable Developmental Goals, even though there was a pandemic and even global conflicts like supply chain disruption, Russia-Ukraine war. So despite this, the world has been moving at a rapid and progressive pace on this. So in fact, when we talk about India, on in achieving sustainable developmental goals. So it has also making rapid progress with respect to all these SDGs. So what is the need for reform of the UN structure? So why we need to reform UN structure? So first and foremost factor when we talk about the reform of the UN structure is outdated structure and decision making process. Okay, so it has not representing the current realities, so it is outdated, it is considered as outdated. For example, if you look at the P5, the permanent members, so even though rightful countries like India, Japan, Germany, Brazil, South Africa, so they are not part of the permanent members, and there's also a huge power imbalance. For example, the P5 members membership is heavily concentrated in Africa because Russia is part of Europe, and UK, France, all these countries are part of Europe. So therefore there's a huge power imbalance and power is heavily concentrated in Europe. However, there is no representation for South America and Africa, and even for countries in Asia. So therefore there's a huge power imbalance, and P5 has not reformed since the establishment of the UN. So in fact, these permanent 5 members are holding veto power. So a veto power means if a decision they consider is not in favor of their interests, so they can put a hold on such decisions, so the decision will not take into effect. So the 5 permanent members holding veto power reflects the geopolitical realities of the post-World War II era. Okay, so it is not representing the current realities, rather it is representing the post-Cold War or post-World War II realities. Now after that, we need to talk about the representation and inclusivity. So virtually United Nations Security Council has no representation from South America, Africa, and Asia. So therefore there's a lack of representation or under representation. So when it lacks representation, so we cannot say that UN is an inclusive body. Okay, so therefore there's a lack of inclusivity. Now the UN decision making bodies need to be more representative. So in this context, they need to be more representative, and UN Security Council has to be further expanded, and more members, regional powers, to be included or to be given membership in the United Nations Security Council. And the other major issue with the United Nations Security Council is ineffectiveness and inefficiency. Now if you look at the UN efficiency with respect to preventing the conflicts like Russia-Ukraine war and the recent Israel-Hamas conflict, or preventing the dispute between Palestine and Israel, so you cannot see that UN is not that much of effective, or it is more efficient with respect to preventing these conflicts. So it has become just a talk shop where members give, where the leaders just give speeches. Okay, so because of all these reasons, so it is proposed that the UN must be reformed. So therefore in this context, what are the proposals to reform UN? Now there are different proposals which are part of the UN. Now when you are asked questions in your interview, so you just have to answer, the questions are like, what are the proposals to reform UN, why there is a need to reform UN. So no need to give a detailed answer, just give reasons 1 2 3. So these are the reasons because of which there's a need for reform. And firstly, we need to reform the United Nations Security Council, because the Security Council has not representing the 21st century realities, and there are several aspiring powers which should be part of the United Nations Security Council. Okay, so there's a lack of representation, under representation, and lack of inclusivity. So because of this reason, there's a need to reform United Nations Security Council. Now after that, we need to talk about expansion of the permanent membership. So in United Nations Security Council, there are 5 members. They are permanent members. So those 5 members are the major powers after World War II, and now also these are the major 5 powers. So however, the aspiring powers, the rising powers like Japan, Germany, India, South Africa, Brazil have been demanding a place at the global high table. So therefore this demand has to be considered, and the permanent membership of the UN has to be expanded. And after that, we need to talk about abolishing or limiting of veto power. Now only these 5 permanent members have the veto powers. So because of the veto powers, it has been promoting the inefficiency and lack of effectiveness of the UN. So therefore, either we need to limit the veto power or we need to abolish the veto power altogether. So this is also the other proposal of the UN to further strengthen the United Nations Security Council. So after that, we need to talk about the inclusive representation of the Global South. Now, what is the Global South? So Global South includes all the countries in South America, Africa, Asia and South Asia. So there's a lack of representation, or most of the region are underrepresented in the United Nations Security Council, and particularly Global South is underrepresented. So that makes the UN is not an inclusive body. So the voice of the Global South is not heard because they lack the representation. So therefore, representation for the Global South is very important, and particularly the inclusive representation of Global South. And after that, we need to talk about streamlining of bureaucracy and decision making as well. Okay, so we need to streamline bureaucracy and decision making process within UN, so that the decision making process will be more effective. Okay, so there will be no red tape in the decision making process. So therefore it makes UN more and more relevant in the present context. So after that, we need to talk about reducing inefficiencies in the administrative process. If you look at the existing administrative process of the United Nations, so it has been facing several issues like inefficient decision making, red tapeism. So that has been delaying the decision making. So therefore, we need to focus on reducing inefficiencies in the administrative process. And after that, enhancing transparency, accountability is also one of the reform proposals of UN. Okay, now UN has lacking transparency and accountability. So therefore, it should be brought in. So fair and equitable distribution of financial resources, of financial contributions. So a lack of equity and lack of fair and equitable distribution of financial resources. For example, few countries get a more higher share of funds from the United Nations, and few countries get a very low share of funds. So therefore, there's a need to provide fair and equitable distribution, ensure fair and equitable distribution of financial resources. Okay, so the overall objective is the distribution has to be done in an equitable manner. Okay, so these are the larger proposals which are part of the UN reform. So after that, we need to talk about the challenges of reforming United Nations. Now firstly, the resistance from the current P5 members. The current P5 members are not agreed to reform United Nations. Okay, so they are not ready to reform the United Nations. So several countries, like, in fact, they are not ready to give away their veto power. Now they have enjoying a privileged position. Because of this reason, they are not ready to give away their veto powers. So after that, the veto wielding countries are reluctant to cede their power because they are enjoying a privileged position. So the need for consensus among permanent members. Now, so these permanent members have already divided into different camps. So therefore, achieving consensus is a difficult task. So there's a need for consensus among all these permanent members. And after that, we need to talk about the geopolitical tensions as well. Okay, so the impact of global conflicts on UN reform efforts. So there are different conflicts where different countries part of, for example, the South China Sea issue, the Indo-Pacific issue, and the rising influence of China in the Indo-Pacific or Indian Ocean, and Russia-Ukraine war, Israel and Palestine conflict. So because of all these global conflicts, it further makes UN reform process more delayed, or there will be lack of consensus among these countries with respect to UN reform. And after that, the role of regional powers has been in increasing at a rapid pace, particularly countries like India. So they are considered as middle powers. Their influence, their power has been rising at a rapid pace. So therefore, over a period of time, the demands from these countries to further expand United Nations Security Council and reform institutions of multilateral governance will increase over a period of time. So therefore, there's a need for concerted action to reform UN. So this is the high time that all the countries, especially the existing P5 members, have to think about the reform. And there's a need to provide representation to otherwise underrepresented countries in South America, Africa, and Asia. Okay, so all the countries should collaborate, cooperate on UN reform process to make UN more and more relevant for the present context. So that is a crucial aspect for ensuring global peace and collective security, which are part of the founding principles of UN Charter. Okay, so that's it in this lecture. Thank you. So please hit the like button and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you.